Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Tom Morgan, a former financier and founder of The Leading Edge, a media platform and transformational community dedicated to sharing world-changing ideas and facilitating life-changing experiences. An Oxford graduate with a master's in philosophy, politics, and economics, he spent 20 years navigating the finance industry, working at top firms like Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, and most recently, Sapient Capital. After becoming disenchanted with finance, he had an awakening experience that caused him to quit his job and explore paths of meaning, leading to a challenging yet transformative multi-year existential crisis. Eventually, he's able to piece together his life, integrating finance with the pursuit of meaning and wisdom. Today, he describes himself as a curiosity sherpa and spends his life seeking out the most interesting thinkers and ideas to share with the world. Enjoy. Tom Morgan, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, so I just want to set a little bit of context before we dive in. So I ran across your Substack and was intrigued by some of your writing. I also saw we had an interest in similar thinkers like John Vervaeke and Ian McGilchrist. And then I realized you had a background in finance, which further piqued my curiosity since I really see people in finance with an interest in what many of us call the liminal web. I also noticed that you recently launched a transformational community called Leading Edge. And I'm very much interested in the role that transformational communities can have on our development, particularly when they're integrated with what Vervaeke calls an ecology of practices. So I'd love to explore some of the ideas in your writing and what you're doing at Leading Edge. But maybe you can start by sharing a little bit about your life in finance, how you ventured from that world into exploring wisdom and the work you're doing today.
Sure, man. Thanks for having me. It's I went to like all the right schools in England and kind of lucked my way into the city of London. Really enjoyed like the first 11 years in finance, moved over to New York at one point and had like a kind of a good experience on Wall Street where I was like, that you're going to pay me what to do what and fly me around the world for free. And it never felt real, which meant that when it kind of all came crashing down in like 08, 09, it wasn't really a surprise to me. I was like, I've worked in the real world and none of this makes any sense. And then eventually I ended up around about 2015 at another investment bank. And there wasn't really much to do. And which I think is not most people's perception of an investment bank. And everyone was very nice, which is also not most people's perception of an investment bank. But I started to gain weight and I started to get like non-specific health ailments. And around me, I noticed that the guys were kind of killing time. And killing time was killing them, that they would come in every day at 7 a.m. and they would leave at 4 or 5 without really having done anything apart from surf the net and send some emails, make some phone calls. But it was all performative. And people started dying, suicide, metaphorical, literal. And I realized that in midlife, at kind of, say the 45-year-old level, most people in our society are told that that's kind of it. That's you now. You're at your peak earning years. You've got 2 kids in private school. You may not have irresponsibly high outgoings. It's just the way the world works. It makes your mobility basically zero. And you're also told that there's no second act. And if there is a second act, it's some sort of like self-sacrifice for which you are going to be paid nothing. People get really trapped psychologically and literally in that situation. And I was one of them. I then was put on an elimination diet. Because no one in the US healthcare system could find anything wrong with me because the US healthcare system cannot diagnose spiritual sicknesses. And the elimination diet gave me clarity. It gave me energy. And I started writing a book. And on the day I finished the book, I realized that I was the subtext of the book, and the book was where it basically showed me that Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is an operating manual for the awakening of consciousness. The moment I had that realization, I had some sort of spiritual awakening experience, stroke, psychotic break. My perception of reality in that moment completely changed temporarily. I could see energy flicking off the trees. My internal monologue shut off for the first time in my life. There were ludicrous synchronicities all around me. And I became precognitive, and basically all of my baseline assumptions about reality, having been a total normie, got thrown out of the window. It took me about 2 months of being insufferably spiritual to bed in that experience. And then Boxing Day of 2017, I made a conscious decision to go on my own hero's journey, as grandiose as that may sound, but went insane at that exact moment, and went into a dark night of the soul that lasted me about 2 years. The imprisoning preoccupation during that period was the reinvention of myself in the second half of life. My biggest mistake was allowing my ego to try and reinvent me, but by destroying me, by putting me into hospice work, social work. I went to Fordham for social work for a semester, to do things that were quote unquote meaningful, but that I didn't enjoy, and had no gift at. I ended up basically being unable to move psychologically by maybe February of 2020. And because everything had failed, the universe had shut down every single option for me. I was offered intravenous ketamine therapy because nothing else had worked. The therapy allowed me to access something buried so deeply in my unconscious that it liberated me kind of unexpectedly. It was a hellish experience, but ended up being redemptive, although it didn't feel like it at the time. And then it took me about 11 months to rebuild my psyche to be able to speak again. And then I started writing about this stuff for a finance audience. And I feel at that point, the universe was like, oh, about time. And then has bestowed successive, inexplicable abundance upon me, where for the last 3 years, I was paid to write about whatever interested me, whether it was Viveki or McGilchrist, with total freedom, and to develop my voice thanks to my previous employers at Sapient Capital, who were wonderful people. And then at the end of this year, I think that I realized I had to follow my own advice, and my time at Sapient was clearly winding down, and I was being called in this new direction, which is the leading edge. But I guess I'll stop there because that's a lot of information.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. There's so much there of like, it's interesting. Like, you went into finance and you actually enjoyed it for a long time, and then at some point, I guess you got a different job or a different role, and it was like what David Gerber calls a bullshit job, or at least everybody around. It was like there was nothing to do. It's like you're getting paid, but even though you're probably making good money, there's nothing to do, and you just feel like it's pointless. And then that kind of ignited this kind of existential or spiritual crisis in you, but also like an awakening, because it seems like some of that was positive, and then it was like it was like a high. It seemed like it was a high, and then it was like a super low. But then what's crazy is for how long it lasted, for a couple of years. And like, what were you doing in those 2 years? Like, you said you were trying different professions. You said you want to go do social work. You went to Fordham. It's interesting because my wife, she's a social worker. She went to Fordham. But yeah, can you talk about more of like what that 2-year experience was like?
Yeah, when I made that kind of embodied, there was something came out of my body on that Boxing Day that basically said, commit to this now. And then at that point, a voice started in my head that was extraordinarily hostile, basically telling me I was worthless and needed to kill myself, and that I was going to run out of money and I was useless. And that looped continuously. Initially, I bought rosary beads and just prayed. Didn't identify as a Catholic, but it felt so hellish and so demonic that I bought rosary beads to try and pray out the voice. It felt almost like a possession by like a malevolent entity, and that voice didn't really stop. And in the meantime, I lost all sense of connection with anything. The only thing I could feel at all was a burning at the center of my chest. To give you some sort of idea, my sister came to visit me in Manhattan, and she took me to 11 Madison Park, the best restaurant in the city. The next day, we watched my team Liverpool win the Champions League final. That evening, we went to see one of my favorite movies, Dunkirk, on the deck of the Intrepid, and went to Madison Square Garden to see Anthony Joshua fight. And I'm a big boxing fan. And all the way through all of this, the only thing I could feel was the burning in my chest. So it was like this incredible day where like everything went right. All of the world was aligned around me and I could literally feel nothing. There was this pane of glass between me and the world. And the passage of time was excruciating. Every morning I'd wake up, there'd be like a maybe 2-second period before my consciousness, my ego switched on. It would be the best time of my day. And from that point forward, time slowed to a crawl. And the only thing I could think about all the time was, what am I going to do next for a job? How am I going to find meaning in life? Why can't I sort this out myself? And it was, in retrospect, I think it was the death knell of the ego, basically realizing it couldn't think its way out of a problem. But that meant it looped on that problem in kind of a desperate way for years. And so even though it was only 2 years, it felt like an infinite period of time. It was, it could have been 100,000 years in that space. And through it all, the preoccupation was like, how do you do second acts, and how am I going to make my life meaningful, and how am I going to find the service?
Mm. Yeah, and so it also sounds like a lot of your identity was wrapped up in the financial role. Was that correct?
Yes and no. Like the day I quit, music has always been a source of synchronicity. And the day I quit, I was listening to this cool song by Rival Consoles called Persona. And I felt dropping the finance persona was quite easy.
Okay.
Finding the next one was almost impossible. And I kept kind of like grasping out for, now I'm going to be a coach in this modality. Now I'm going to be an existential humanist therapist. Now I'm going to be a Jungian analyst. Now I'm going to be a social worker, because it is the next identity that will save me. Shedding the finance identity felt dirty to me. It felt like it was immoral. And so shifting that was actually pretty easy. In fact, reclaiming it years later was harder, because I was like, I left this industry. Should I go back? And you should never go back in certain circumstances. During the time I was in trouble, I went back and sold credit card data to hedge funds, which was by far the worst 11 months of my life. And I went completely even more insane. I guess the thing I'll say that's applicable to people listening, because I think it's of like archetypal importance, is this idea that I've come to believe is true, which is like, the 20s and 30s, give or take, of people's lives is about the cultivation of these kind of left hemispheric, analytical, executive function skills. That there's nothing wrong with that. Like, that's why I think I really enjoyed the first 11 years in finance, that it was like, I'm really intellectually stimulated and I'm learning a lot, but I'm also being trained in something. But then if you miss the boat of inverting those skills in service of something meaningful, that's when the trouble starts. That basically, like, I see a lot of people that are really good at things, but have stopped being interested in the subject matter they work in because it's a closed system of some kind. Like finance is a zero-sum game. It's a closed system. And then when I inverted that skill set, like I would have been a very, very bad social worker, probably unlike your wife, right? Like I would have been a bad Jungian analyst. But what I'm good at is like synthesizing information for people that are short on time, or like spotting insights in long books like Ian McGilchrist's 1,500-page book. Like I enjoy synthesizing that stuff and distilling it. When I applied that to stuff I cared about, the universe was like, oh, thank God, right? But it's the inversion of this skill set that it seems to be the most important pattern.
Yeah. Moving from a left brain dominant to integrating the left and the right brain hemispheres. And that's, Ian McGilchrist's idea. I know that's been a huge idea for me. And like, I've never actually read his second book. Maybe that's his third, Matter of Things. But The Master and His Emissary was definitely one of my favorites. Also, it was a tough book to read, but very insightful and insane amount of evidence that he shows there for his argument. There's still people that doubt what he's saying, but the way he argues it is just, there's so much. And it's definitely something I've seen in my own life. Like the left brain dominance. Like for me, I had pursued music for a while. So I was a rapper, and that was something that I pursued for a long time. And then that kind of didn't work out. And that led to my kind of existential crisis. And from there, I was kind of rebuilding and also trying to figure out what is my identity, what is my purpose, what am I going to do? And from there, I got a lot more into like intellectual pursuits and reading a lot and stuff like that. And I actually feel like I became more left brain dominant than before. I was doing music, and it had this kind of aspect of, writing lyrics, but also listening to music and putting it together. And I would get into these immersive flow states for hours. And then, coming and doing more reading and writing and kind of intellectual stuff really felt a lot more like being left brain dominant. And it's still a process for me figuring out how do I balance that? Because there's definitely times where I notice I'm like, whoa, you're just too focused. You're too zoomed in on something. And and that's when the distress arises.
Yeah. After I came out of the crisis, one of my biggest weaknesses when you work in finance, right? Like finance is about the construction of abstract intellectual futures that basically people will say to you, this is how the world is, or this is how the world is about to be. And they tend to be very, 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 very clever and well argued and internally consistent and coherent. And 99% of them are going to be wrong because the future only works out one way, and legendarily wrong. And I took an enormous amount of self-worth from repeating things that I thought sounded clever, which is dangerous. Like it's, I think you can go really deep down the rabbit hole of understanding how sinister speaking without engaging your heart is. I think it's one of my biggest risk factors in terms of my character, is talking about things that I don't embody, or like repeating stuff just because it sounds really clever and therefore people will think I'm really clever. And the thing that happened after my crisis was I just started to get an embodied sense of what was or wasn't true. And people would tell me things and I'd be like, I can't explain why that seems like bullshit. I just think it is. And like, it's not like I'm some sort of savant now, but that is a skill that can be cultivated. And that's really important because it helps you orient yourself. And reading McGilchrist's stuff, I was like, oh, this is the first time I'm reading a relatively rational theory that actually correlates to everything that I experienced in the woo phases of my existence. That I also believe it's actually true. But it was like, oh, like if you have like some crazy psychotic break, but accompanied with like precognition and synchronicities and all this other stuff that are currently not explained by a materialist worldview, you're either insane and need to be medicated and institutionalized, or you're enlightened. And neither of those are quite right. I think both of them are right, but neither of them are right. And not having a framework to interpret that experience, it makes it much, much harder.
Yeah, the other thing that was coming up was you were talking about how in finance it's all about kind of presenting this sense of certainty, like, oh, I know what the future holds, even though nobody really knows. And that's a left brain dominant kind of thing, because the left brain loves certainty. It's all about grasping and trying to understand and like get a hold of reality. Where the right brain, it allows more kind of ambiguity and uncertainty to be there. So it's interesting how certain professions also are maybe more geared towards a certain functioning. But the other thing too, I definitely resonate with, the repeating or saying things that sound good or influential that aren't necessarily true. Like that's an easy kind of thing to fall into. And I think for my personality also, like I think I've been a fairly articulate person, and then I did rap, and rap was all about kind of performance and like creating an image. So it's very easy to kind of fall into that. And then I came across this practice called circling. Have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. Tell me.
Yeah. So, it's a practice that really, it's a relational practice, and it really changes the way that we relate to people. Often we're talking about something else in our relationships, but circling kind of shifts it right to the immediacy and right to the connection between us. And it gets kind of underneath the stories to the embodiment, to the emotions that's here, to the feelings that are here in our relationship right now in this moment. And so getting to do that was just so interesting to see how much rationalizing I had, or how many stories I had, or just kind of these dynamics, these social dynamics that I got so used to playing into. And then getting to learn that practice and practice with other people, it kind of felt like that was also getting into more of integration with the left and the right brain. The left brain also likes to confabulate, like it will make up these stories. And that's a lot of the rationalization that we do is just, it's just a story to not deal with maybe a certain emotion that's underneath there.
Yeah. It's why I've become so interested in myth, which is like the worst word in the world because it implies falsehood. But you realize that myth speaks to like archetypal hidden forces and trends. And so actually when you hear a myth, it lands in your body in a different way to like a news story, right? They're just fundamentally different things. And you realize after a while that like that one of the hardest things for me recently, the last year or so, I've been in really deep water, like with the esoteric stuff, with like psychic phenomena, like all of this stuff, which I'm increasingly believing is scientifically supported based on the research of a lot of my friends who I really trust. But I have had no real direct experience with, aside from a very brief period of being precognitive around my awakening experience, right? So like the door is like a little ajar in terms of me thinking that like, yeah, this stuff's real, but determining where it's real is really, really hard for me because you know, openness is the number one trait related to wisdom. But if you're too open, your brain falls out. And like, I'm now trying to say, like, if I encounter some esoteric myth about how the world was really formed, or Atlantis, or the ancient Egyptians, or whatever it is, right? I'm like, okay, does this story resonate with me? Why does it resonate with me? Does it reflect something in my inner world that I need to address? And if so, is there anything I can do about it, right? Like, okay, so the world is ruled by lizard people. Right? Okay. So like, is that true? Don't know. Am I ever going to know if it's true? Don't know. What does it reflect in me that I'm interested in the world being ruled by lizard people? Maybe I lack agency, right? Maybe I require convenient explanations for things that are chaotic. Whatever it is, right? Like I don't actually believe the world is ruled by lizard people, but just thinking about like the most extreme examples of weirdo conspiracy theories, I'm like, what do they reflect in the world? What do they reflect in my life? And does my body say this is true? Because I'm not an embodied person, as you can tell. Like I'm an intellectual weirdo. And so like learning to drop into my body when I hear people say stuff and I hear stories has been a challenge.
Yeah. It's interesting because the mythical lens, like, that's how you kind of look at dreams too. They're symbolic, right? When you have a dream about something, the way people usually want to interpret a dream is like very literal, like, oh, this person died in the dream. Oh my God, this person might die. But it's what is that their death representing for you symbolically? So it's interesting how you can take that same kind of symbolic lens towards different things and different ideas and beliefs and things that pop up. Like, well, what does this mean? What does this mean about my own psyche of how I relate to the world?
Dude, I'm doing this series right now, an 8-part series of basically taking people from like hyper rational to a little bit more woo, but based in like practical suggestions rather than just like, hey, UFOs. And the dream work stuff has been the biggest incremental for me. And there's one thing that happened that was like, so I had a dream that me and my wife were sheltering in the house, and there was something really scary trying to get in. And someone had told me, you're everything in the dream. Right. And that idea blew my mind because I'm like, oh shit, I'm the scary thing trying to get in. And it was at that time, this was like a couple of weeks ago. And at the time I realized that I was going to be exposed to something really scary in my own shadow that I hadn't really ever coped with. And that I was actually preventing that from getting in my own behavior. And actually extending that, like, I've always been told, yeah, we're all one, yada, yada, yada. And it just hasn't landed for me in any plausible way because, like, that's just not how I live my life, that we're all one. Like, I try and be compassionate, but that's about as far as it's going to go. But when I suddenly thought, I'm everyone in the dream, and now I try and apply that to people symbolically, like, if everything's a metaphor, that guy that really pisses me off, he's me, right? He's me in the dream. Like I've understood that as a shadow work thing, but now I'm like, oh, like if this is all a dream and I'm everyone in the dream, what does it mean that I really don't like that person? And that's, I know that may not sound weird to anyone listening, but like that's been really interesting to me.
Yeah, it doesn't sound weird to me because I think that is the core of shadow work. It's like you engage with somebody and there's something you don't like about them. There's probably that same part within you that's pushed away or repressed. Have you heard of parts work? It's very very big modality. So a lot of it is like that. Like there's all these different parts of ourselves, and we have parts that we like, or we have parts that we have a better relationship with, and those kind of they're at the forefront. And then you have these other parts that are often unconscious, and then every once in a while they'll get triggered or bubble up, and that's when we get a glimpse, and we're like, oh my God, I was acting out of character. That wasn't me. But it's like, no, yes, that was you too. That was another part of you. But that's just, there's these aspects of ourselves that we don't want to see. So it's interesting how you can apply the same stuff in dream work and in, while you're awake, while you're moving around the world.
Yeah, it scared me a lot because if you haven't acknowledged that part in you, and something that's been coming up recently is like my capacity to be dangerous. And it's not something I've ever assumed was true about myself, right? Like I do jujitsu like badly, but I like to think I'm like a nice guy and like humble. And I'm running this community full of really powerful people now. And what the universe was like, nah, dude, you're dangerous. You have more potential, more positive potential than you realized you did. But that means you have more darkness. And the problem is if you haven't integrated that part is going to get activated at a time when you're not emotionally equipped to handle it. Like if you can see it, you're at a big advantage. Like you're not going to necessarily win the game, but like it's integrated and you're like, oh, that thing's showing up again. But if you can't even see it, you don't even know it's there, when suddenly something happens to trigger it, you're going to go nuts and things are going to get out of control real fast. Yeah.
Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that, about this idea that like you have to realize that you're a monster. And there's nothing noble in not doing evil things or destroying something when you're like not capable of it, like a rabbit. Like a rabbit is innocent and they don't do anything. But like for a lion or a gorilla, being the embodiment of that kind of an animal and not acting on that, that's where there's nobility. It's like knowing that you can hurt, you can destroy. I'm capable of doing that, but I figured out how to work with that energy and transmute it in a way where I don't act on that.
Dude, I've spent more time thinking about Jordan Peterson than any man alive, as in not me, but like thinking about him, right? Like it's, why is his house filled with pictures of tyrants and dictators and communist propaganda? Because it's him, right? Like the pivot he's made, in my personal opinion, to like his public persona right now, there is a part of him, like, I don't know if you've ever heard this story, but in Maps of Meaning, which is like a wild,
love that book.
Yeah, it's an almost psychedelic book, right? Like he tells this story about the voice in his head, where basically like when he was like in his 20s, he'd say stuff that sounded smart and he'd win debates because he's so smart. And then a voice in his head would say, you don't believe that. And then he'd get a panic attack. And he didn't know which side of his psyche he was until he'd only say stuff the censor would let through. And it pulled him together psychologically, but also I think gave him a sense for the sacred, for what was archetypally true, which is how this pretty obscure professor ends up having a following of tens, maybe hundreds of millions, definitely hundreds of millions of people. But he still has this vulnerability, which is this left hemispheric like takeover, the tyrant that he talks about incredibly articulately throughout his work, this satanic voice that you hear him speak with when he goes on podcasts, whenever he talks about like climate change or gender or politics or like Trudeau or any of these things that are all like touch points for his audience. And whenever he talks about stuff he really understands, like mythology and psychology and symbolism, like he talks with a completely different kind of voice and authority. And it really interests me that like that strikes me as an unintegrated part. And David Fuller, the guy that ran Rebel Wisdom, wrote a really interesting piece about him, which is now seems to have been scrubbed off the internet. But basically was like, this guy had no grounding. He was a literal lightning rod for the culture wars, and he had no grounding. He didn't have embodiment practices, and he probably didn't have a community around him to tell him he was being an idiot. And like, that's a risk factor for me. Like, it's not like I've got hundreds of millions. I don't have tens of people, but it's a risk for all of us that can speak fluently to be like, are you talking without your heart engaged? And whenever I see people online, it really triggers me, which shows my risk factor, right? Like, all of these guys that can talk really, really articulately about stuff, but they don't embody it.
Yeah. In hearing that, what comes up, and like, I'm a huge Peterson fan. And you hear kind of critiques of him and kind of how the direction he kind of went. But I see there's this dynamic between kind of truth and love, and, kind of being really sharp and smart, and then the heart and the embodiment. And like, I have a propensity to lean into truth, and I feel like he does too. And you can become very kind of abrasive, and lose your sense of humanity, or get almost like too serious. And that's what I noticed that happens with him. And I see that same pattern playing out in me. But I am wondering about the pictures of the tyrants, because like, I was when you were saying that, I was thinking about Ram Dass and how he used to have a picture of Donald Trump and a picture of Obama as like a way to integrate, like, yes, there's a Trump in me and there's an Obama in me, and like, all of these people are in me. Like, it's all just a play in my psyche.
Dude, yeah. I think about it all the time, right? Like, the sign that someone still triggers me is a sign that I probably haven't dealt with it.
Yeah. So, you call yourself a curiosity Sherpa, and, you've kind of mentioned some things about like embodiment. You mentioned heart. I know you had an article that, the heart is an organ of perception, but I'm just wondering, what are kind of maybe some other ideas, different ideas that you've learned about curiosity, or how you've learned to tune into curiosity, like what makes you curious, and, what are kind of the blockages for people that are struggling to, access what they're curious about, what they're passionate about.
I was recommended a book this week, funnily enough, which I read. It's like one of those books you can read in 90 minutes, and it's called Syntropy. And Syntropy, and the word is made up, but it's basically like, in 1942 there was an Italian mathematician, I think Frantipe was his name, and basically he said there's entropy. We all understand that, things fall apart, look around, but there's also syntropy, which in his opinion acted as an attractor from the future backwards in time, which completely fries my brain. But basically, like, syntropy is an invisible force that guides us towards wholeness and complexity. And you can see that both of these things are true. That, like, yeah, dude, you're going to die. But also, like, things are getting more complex around us all the time. Things are getting more conscious around us all the times. The human brain is the most complex thing in the known universe. And to the best of our knowledge, it is also the most conscious thing in the known universe, right? So these two things are happening simultaneously. They're not opposing each other. They're just simultaneous forces. And like, the other word for this that the legendary systems theorist Ervin Laszlo said, is called the holotropic attractor, an attractor that pulls you towards wholeness. And it's a very subtle spiritual insight. And I think that's what you can sometimes feel manifested through your curiosity, which is basically like, there's an evolutionary force. And funny enough, the syntropy, the guys that develop syntropy also think it operates through your solar plexus and heart. That, like, there's an energetic center to your body that pulls you towards an optimal future, let's say. And the thing that's really come out from this series that I'm writing, which wasn't what I expected, it was a real surprise. This word came out of this series, which was subtle. And I realized, maybe this is obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, that the reason why you do all these things, meditation, eat clean, breath work, somatic sensing, even circling, right? It's to give you a taste for subtlety, because the attractor that is going to guide your life in a beneficial direction, like it is literally life force. It is literally the force that gives you life. The attractor that guides you in that direction is incredibly subtle. And so if you've drowned it out with whatever your favorite numbing agent is, you are not going to be able to orient your life. And actually, like, often it may require a modest or dramatic burning down of your life. So the more radical that voice gets, the more aggressive you're going to get in the numbing of it. You know, this is one of my favorite expressions or passages from C.S. Lewis is, God whispers to us in our conscience, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, and shouts in our pains. And my experience in finance was that God started shouting in my pains, that my body and mind started breaking down because I was consistently ignoring that sense of curiosity attractor that eventually I honored. But like, if you're numbing that sense of curiosity, you're in real trouble.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very interesting point, that this kind of guidance within us is so subtle, and it's so easy to drown it out in noise and different things and social media or alcohol or whatever your drug is, whatever your thing is, whatever the noise is that, takes away from the silence, takes away from your ability to kind of listen to that. So it's really interesting how, so it's just so easy to miss, but it's almost like there's something within that, like when there's this kind of ignoring it, it flips, because it goes from being subtle to yelling, to shouting, where it's like you're not paying attention. So now I'm going to have to raise the volume so you do start paying attention.
Yeah, I always think about, like, I'm sure someone else has said this, but like your daemon becomes a demon, right? Like nature selects against things that don't keep moving, right? And I think I've been thinking this week actually about this idea of, the authors of Syntropy are talking about, like, when you're shut off from this force, you feel depressed, you feel empty, you can even feel like dizzy and nauseous. And I existed in this state for 2 years of complete abstraction. And maybe that burning in the center of my chest was this call for reconnection to this attractor that, for whatever reason, my left hemisphere or my psyche or my ego, whatever you want to call it, had shut down because it was afraid of losing control. And again, you have done, like, one of the expressions that I read when I was in crisis was a closed system eats itself. It is forced to feed on itself because there's no energy. And if you've ever had really serious depression, you do get this sense that you're kind of energetically feeding on yourself. Your brain goes in these loops, and you feel like you've no energy for anything else because you're completely closed to your environment. And actually, like, if I can do anything with my work, it's to make people believe that attractors exist and that they're intelligent and that they're beneficial. And you can call it God, and you can call it the universe, and you can call it evolution, and all the words are rubbish. But if people have faith that that thing exists and it's grounded in science, like particularly emerging science, like, that's a huge deal.
You know what's coming up. I'm really curious how, like, you've went through this big shift. I'm curious, how is your day different? How does your day look different now to the Tom before kind of going through that existential crisis?
Yeah. Well, I realized that you have to optimize for process. The thing about living driven by that attractor, or the left or the right hemisphere, or whatever you want to call it, is you don't get certainty. That you have to be ready to pivot at any moment, which means that you should always optimize for the daily process rather than for any goals, which is very hard to do in today's world, but I've managed to find a way of doing it. But basically, it's like, I just started my own business. I went from a really generous salary to zero overnight with no certainty that I would ever make a penny. Like, in the first 4 weeks, my community has been a raging, roaring success, but I had no guarantee of that at the time. And the reason why I wasn't anxious was, one, because I had incrementally more faith that the universe loved me, which is the hardest thing in the entire world. But also, I knew that the next day I would wake up and I would be in a routine that I can flow in for an indefinite period of time, which is I wake up when my little boy crawls into bed with me. Little so-and-so will do it often like 6:30 a.m. So like I'll wake up between then and 7:30. I'll get up. I'll go to my desk, which as you can see is in my bedroom, and I'll start writing. And I'll put on banging melodic house music. And I'll sit there for 4 hours, give or take, and I'll write, which brings me enormous pleasure. But I'll write only about stuff that I feel will be interesting and helpful to other people. Like I don't write bad poetry. I write about the stuff that brought you to my door, right? And brought me my small audience. And then I'll go to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because it gets me fully out of my head, get my ass kicked. It's the best form of exercise and flow that I've ever discovered by a factor of 50. And then I'll come back completely mentally refreshed, and I'll spend most of my afternoon meeting people. Anyone that reaches out to me to a meeting, I'll almost always accept. And I'm meeting people a lot through my current community. And then, my kids get home about 5, and I'll spend the rest of the day hanging with my kids. I'm actually really my biggest deficiency is being fully attentive to my children at the end of the day. Like I'm bad at that, and I think I need to work on that because everything else is working really well. But I feel that people who don't know where to go next in life, the moment they've lost direction, they try and find a new goal, which is what I found. I was like, I'm going to go back to social work school for 3 years because at the end of it, I'll be a social worker. And that seems like a morally responsible thing to do. And I should have asked was like, is anything about this social work course going to be interesting to me? And the answer after I'd started it was, God, no. It was gun in the mouth boring to me. Like the textbooks were brutal. The classwork was brutal. And I wasn't even sure when the in-person social work stuff started, whether I was going to like it or be good at it. And that was a major mistake.
Yeah. What's coming up in hearing you talk right now is there's this book called Why Greatness Can Be Planned. And it basically talks about how, how you take a step, like every step is a stepping stone. You don't know what the next thing is till it arises. And then you go and you move on to that step, and you just move from stepping stone to stepping stone, but you can't see the full thing. So like projecting into the future, like in 2 years, I'll be doing this, or in 2 years, I'll have this. It's, you can't predict that. You never know where this kind of life will take. I see your face light up. So I'm imagining that you've run across that book also.
Do you know what I'm writing about for my piece in 3 days' time?
Please share.
Why greatness can't be planned.
Is it? Have you read that book?
Yeah, literally about that book and about that strategy. And I'm writing a piece about attractors for this weekend that I imagine will be out by the time people are listening to this. But it's like, it's the coolest articulation of attractors that I've ever found. I mean, just as a quick digression, right? So like I got invited to this finance conference at the start of this year, and it was 8 hours a day in a room with like giants of finance. And they were all presenting XY charts, right? Like single axis charts. And I was like, oh shit, this is the water that we swim in finance and Silicon Valley, which is like where a single abstract metric, like a goal, right, is the point. Up and to the right is pretty much the point. And that's how a lot of people structure their lives, right? They have the certainty that if the net worth is going up and to the right, everything's going well. That's 2-dimensional. So what happens if you add 3 dimensions? It becomes a fitness landscape, which suddenly means you have an infinite number of choices, which is scary. But it also means that I don't know if people are familiar with the concept of fitness landscapes, but like there are local peaks and there are global peaks. There's little hills and there are big hills. And the goal of any organism is to get to the highest hill, the top of the highest hill, which means that when you've hit the top of a local peak, you need to go down to go up again. You need to surrender fitness to experiment again, which means that if you're in the wrong part of your career, you need to give something up often to go and experiment with someone else and to reorient yourself around something else. Now add a 4th dimension to that chart, and it becomes a sea. That basically everything else is changing and evolving around you. And the more chaotic it is, the more that surface of the sea looks like a storm. I don't believe that evolution just throws everyone into a sea, into a storm, and it says sort it out. I believe that an attractor is something that orients you through that storm, like a constellation, that draws you towards it and it operates through space and time. And I believe that attractor is curiosity and what you're interested in. And the Ken Stanley research shows that appears to be true, that if you pursue what you're interested in, novelty and life is actually an outcome. And it doesn't surprise me because evolution optimizes for novelty in life. This is this syntropic idea again, that if you pursue what is an attractor, novelty in life will be part of your life. Like you can't, the question for anyone is always like, great, will I be able to pay my bills? And I don't know how intelligent the universe is in terms of giving you enough and whether it really responds to the comforts that you require. But what I have seen in my own life and enough data points around me is that when you have the courage to pursue the correct attractor, which is a big caveat, like shit just works out.
Yeah. It's interesting because this is the thing that I was, and the synchronicity about why greatness can be planned, and that you're actually writing about that book and that I brought it up. That's an interesting thing there too. But I guess you're kind of speaking to that, but it'll be interesting to unpack this a little bit more, this kind of relationship between money and meaning and finance, and how that plays into our ability to follow our curiosity. You've said that wisdom is the ability to pursue what you love and ignore what you don't. And that basically wealth is what allows you in some capacity to pursue wisdom. And in some way, this makes sense. Like, I know some people have figured out how to create wealth, and then that opens up their ability to explore whatever they want. But I know many people, such as myself, are still kind of grappling with money and meaning and trying to pursue wisdom simultaneously. Thus far, I haven't created any significant wealth in my life. And, with 2 children, a family, a mortgage, finances are constant pressure. But at the same time, I feel like I somehow make time to work and engage in activities that are meaningful and that I hope are helping me grow more wise. I'm curious, do you have any insights for those trying to kind of navigate this relationship between money and meaning, or money and wisdom, and trying to kind of do these things at the same time? Do you have any insights for how they could kind of navigate that path?
I have no insight. I have questions. Like, there's a dynamic one that, to be harsh, a lot of quote unquote spiritual people I meet have no executive function. That, like, I've joined a lot of spiritual communities, and what they'll do is they'll be in these closed spiritual communities, often inventing language that they themselves made up to talk about issues that they can't influence. That a lot of spiritual people tend to be very systemically focused. We need to tackle climate change right now. It's like, well, do you know anyone that can influence climate change? No. So what are you going to do? Like, complain about it on our blog? Okay, great. Does that have any reach? Does that have any influence? No. I'm much more interested in a left hemispheric high agency person that is moving right hemispheric than a right hemispheric person that is trying to move left hemispheric, because these guys have the tools to change things. It's why my community is like wealthy, curious left hemispheric people on the whole, which makes it maybe not unique, but certainly very, very unusual. The question is, for anyone that doesn't have that money yet, is like, so what the hell do I do? And the perhaps the biggest question I've ever encountered, and I'm trying to answer it with my own life right now, having just zeroed out my life, is that, like, if you find the right path, does the universe react irrespective of your economic means? Because the biggest pushback I get for my work, which is the most valid thing ever, is, dude, you are privileged. It is my least favorite word because it dehumanizes people, but it's basically like, due to the combination of your circumstances and the places you've started, you have the freedom to pursue this abstract, airy-fairy spiritual bullshit, which other people don't have because they're too busy to put food on the table. And I would like to think that, call it God, God is powerful enough that he's more powerful than the capitalist market system, right? Which means that if you find your niche, things will work out. Right. And the level of faith that requires when you're living hand to mouth is really, 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 really hard, to the point of being impossible. And I've just gone through it. I've just leapt. Right. And so far I've been held. But it's an open question for me. And in fact, it's part of the reason why I left my job. I wrote a piece called The Great Betrayal, which is the idea of leaving a marriage that's become loveless because you believe there's someone else out there that will actually really love you. And this dynamic, when you talk to people in transition, often just immediately brings them to tears, which is that they don't believe that there's anything out there that will hold them if they indeed find that right combination. But that's the caveat. which is that you have to be doing something of value. And one of the perhaps more like abstract ideas is this idea of differentiation and integration, which is you have to find something that plays to your gifts while also being what the universe is asking of you. Like, to go back to the tangible example, it was only when I used the skills I'd acquired in finance to write about these issues within that framework that the universe finally offered me a way out of hell. I was in hell, right? Like, this was not like a privileged position that I was in, but I got my way out of it, but due to offering the right sacrifice, I think. And for the last 3 or 4 years, it's been proven that that's the case. But I might just be delusional.
Yeah. We're all a little bit delusional. So, this conversation about money and meaning also makes me think about the dynamic between being a generalist and a specialist. And at the end of one of your articles, you share a story from the end of Ian McKilker's book, The Matter with Things, which is fascinating. And, it's basically about this member of the Swiss parliament who reflects on Carl Jung's meeting with a Pueblo chief who says that the white man is doomed because he only looks at one point and excludes everything else. And then later in life, this parliament member meets a self-made billionaire and asks him the secret to his success. And he says that it's due to him being able to concentrate on one point while excluding all other aspects. So this is like a very eerie story that to me highlights this contrast between a holistic generalist view, which is very common for indigenous people, versus the concentrated specialist view, which the dominant Western culture kind of pressures us into. And personally, sometimes it feels like having to cut off certain parts of yourself in order to be able to capitalize off one thing. So what thoughts do you have in regards to like this dynamic between being a generalist and a specialist?
Yes. Right? Yes is the answer. Yes, and
yeah.
Right? Yeah. Like I would point anyone towards the epilogue of Richard Tarnas's Passion of the Western Mind. It's free online, and I just read the last 4 pages. And the last 4 pages are like profoundly optimistic, because what it says is that like in the Enlightenment, from the Enlightenment to today, we've gained this stunningly powerful left hemisphere, this ability to focus on one thing, this ludicrously intense executive function that brought us iPhones, like for better or for worse. It brought us this incredible technological abundance. It, it's crushed infant mortality. It's done all these incredible things, but it also has these really major downsides because it can't see the whole picture. And he thinks that this has been a deliberate departure, an archetypal departure, so that eventually this left hemisphere can be placed under the more feminine, holistic right. And I think there are signs of that. He picks out 30 different signs of us moving back towards this more holistic, embodied sense. But to go back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, right? It's, you don't strip anything out. You just, my favorite expression, I saw the correct version of it online a few weeks ago, which was that like, if you don't give a husky an interesting problem, it becomes an interesting problem. Like, that's how I think about the left hemisphere. That's how I think about my intellect. That's how I think about my ego. My ego now always has interesting problems. And as a result, like, I can do monofocus on stuff that I care about. And then when I no longer care about it, I put my head up and I'm like, okay, what's next? You need both. But if the ego is always driving the bus, you are going to go over a cliff inevitably. And that is that switching where you have to understand that the right hemisphere is always in charge. That switching is somatic and emotional. And that's what needs to be taking priority. And then you need to have the faith to trust it a little bit when it's pointing you in a different direction.
Yeah. That makes sense. Like the fact that when we're working or we're trying to solve a problem and you have a sense of certainty, like you understand what the problem is, understand what you're doing. And then it's also easy to kind of just want to like keep doing that. Like I noticed for myself, it's like when you're chewing on a problem, sometimes it's hard to let go of it, to stop grasping. But there's something about letting that go, trusting that actually I'm going to step away. I'm going to stop working on this. And I'm just going to allow my mind to run or go do something else. Like for you, it's jiu-jitsu. For somebody else, it's taking a walk. And like being in a completely different headspace, knowing that, trusting that actually maybe that problem is getting solved on an unconscious level, like even when you're not there, that's actually more beneficial than just keep going and just keep trying to do it and push the pedal till you crash and flip the car.
I don't know about that, like, because that's how my brain works.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's this other dynamic. Like, I was thinking the other day, but I don't know anything about crypto. But like, apparently the way like crypto works is you have these incredibly powerful mining rigs that work on complex math problems, and when they do, they get rewarded with cash, right? I think they get rewarded with Bitcoin. They're mining Bitcoin, right? I think of my brain in a similar way, that like I put the left hemisphere compute to a problem, and I kind of donate my brain to the global brain, and I'm like, I'm going to think about something that I think is valuable, and then I set it to that, like in the foreground, not just in the background. Like I spend an enormous amount of my day thinking about this stuff and talking about it, right? And I feel that like I'm kind of donating my circuitry for that, and in return I get value. I get these insights, I get these sudden downloads of Bitcoin where I was like, oh wow, how incredibly valuable that is. I now understand something. There have been things I've thought about for 4 to 5 years. There are things I'm still thinking about, problems. Like the thing I'm thinking about right now and living is this question of money, right? Like, what is the relationship of money? If you finally find the right combination of things, will you be delivered abundance? Is the reason why you haven't been delivered abundance because you don't have the right combination of left and right hemisphere? Like, is everyone available to follow their bliss? Like, that I think is the biggest question in the world, because if everyone was shown to some degree that their free will could lead them to follow their bliss and everything would be okay, everything you and I see outside in New York would like cease to exist overnight. There'd be no one collecting trash. There'd be no one working at Taco Bell. There'd be no accountants. There'd be no one in any of the office blocks, right? Like, but also, is the intelligence that organized the universe intelligent enough to reconfigure society in a way that benefits everyone? Like, for me, that's the most interesting question in the world, and I'm living it and experimenting with it at the moment.
Yeah, I feel like this is a big question to me, and this is also like the money and meaning question. And you think about it, like I think about it, and it's like, it seems like there's certain routes or there's certain professions that are rewarded a lot more financially. And there's like, I find a lot of people in the liminal space, a lot of facilitators, coaches, creatives that struggle to, that produce a lot of amazing things, that have immense skill. Like some of these facilitators are remarkable what they can do, but it's almost like people don't even have a demand for that. Like there's some of these circling facilitators, like, I've been doing it for years, but there's people that are far more skilled than me that I'll never be as skilled as them. And many of them struggle to make money, but it's like they actually possess incredible skill. But it makes me think that, a lot of the world doesn't even realize they need that. Like when I try to, introduce people to circling practice, a lot of people like will kind of shy away from it, or they'll engage with it. They'll see some of the benefits of it, and then they kind of move away from it. So it just kind of makes me think of like, there's people that possess these incredible gifts, but what if the world isn't ready for it? So, whereas like what you're saying too, it's like, well, maybe you haven't found the right gift, or if you haven't figured out how to market what you're selling, or, what you have.
That's part of it. But I also think the matching system in the world doesn't work. So that's actually part of why I created my business. I noticed this dynamic, which we talked about up front, which was this stuck dudes, basically. It's mostly men. Their bank balances are getting larger. They're getting desperate, but they don't see anything that they're willing to deploy value. They're basically the stuck masculine energy will not spend money on the feminine. It won't spend money on anything creative, anything chaotic, anything intuitive. All of those roles are structurally underpaid in society, but also like people don't pay what they should for transformative gifts. For the last year, I've probably met 80 to 100 practitioners, like you mentioned, not in circling, but all these other modalities. And I would say 20% are gifted and living like subsistence. A lot of people don't have executive function, they don't have offerings, and they aren't as good as they think they are. That's the harsh truth. They're not doing the right thing. But there are a lot of people that are doing the right thing, whose value has not been recognized by the economic system that we're in. And so I have created my community, which is like, just to digress, I've created a community of 150 people, which have ended up being mostly like left hemispheric to right hemispheric curious people, basically people like me from finance. And we explore these issues. I'm writing content around it. I'm writing this 8-part series on wisdom. But then we also maintain a database of trusted practitioners and practices. Like, I think the right way to look at this is a menu, where it's like you walk into a restaurant and you recommend to your buddy, hey, buddy, try the circling. You might like it. They try the circling and they hate it. And you're like, okay, you didn't like the circling? Pick this off the menu. Pick breath work off the menu. And I don't want people to be dilettantes and dip in and out of things. But like, my ecology of practices, like to use Viveki's term, is different to yours. And it's likely to always be different to yours. Like, I like DJing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, massage, and writing to banging house music, right? I imagine most people are different. And there needs to be a community and a way of experimenting with these modalities in a safe way. And I created this community so that at least the menu is really high quality, that everyone in there is one of these circling facilitators. And I'd be very interested to know who you think are the best. Anyone listening, if there's someone that they think is absolutely elite at something, you can get world-class practitioners whose value is often not world-class, right? Like, I've worked with people who charge thousands of dollars an hour. Thankfully, I'm not usually paying, but I've also worked with people that are charging a couple of hundred, but providing value that is in the thousands of dollars an hour. And part of what I want to do is close that arbitrage. That if I'm connecting a billionaire to someone that's charging $200 an hour, I'll be like, hey, dude, like, maybe you should think that she's actually like living hand to mouth in Michigan, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting you started talking about the leading edge, and that's the name of your community. That's actually what I wanted to talk about next. I also feel called to curate such a community myself. And, I'm a part of different communities that, are similar in that I kind of label them as transformational community, and they kind of center around dialogue and different practices. Some of them, like one of them is in a particular Buddhist tradition. I've also been a part of the circling community called relateful.com. I've been with that, with that community for several years. And so I've been in different communities, and I kind of envision that all of these communities could be nodes in a bigger network, because in a lot of ways, there's so much overlap what they're doing, even though it's unique and different. Like you said, your ecology of practices might be different than my ecology of practices. But my sense is that many of these communities, they are orienting towards wisdom. They are orienting towards truth and love and integrating left and right, ways of knowing. Some of them maybe not left and right, maybe just kind of going into right brain stuff, because the left brain's been so dominant that it's kind of like a way to rebalance things. I'm very interested actually in how do you integrate both, how do you integrate intellect and heart? But yeah, it's really cool that you're doing what you're doing, and you just launched it, right? And I seen you have like a course you created, like I think it's like I don't know if it's an 8-month thing, but it's basically you're doing like a module what is kind of like, I'm thinking about how you imagined it, and kind of like, do you have monthly calls? What is kind of, besides for having the kind of the framework that you're building around it, what else are you doing within the community?
Yeah, so I wanted it to not be scalable, because I realized that the moment anything goes over 150, that Dunbar's number, things fall apart. So I've sort of capped my earnings, but I've seen enough data on this to know that it doesn't work. So like maybe I think the network of networks is the future, and maybe the brand, like if the leading edge really comes to be trusted, then maybe you're like, this is a leading edge certified practitioner, just means that we can trust them, right? Like that's the only way this scales. And if there end up being 1 million chapters of the leading edge that all operate with 100% integrity, great, I'll accept your billions. Thanks very much. But right now it's defiantly non-scalable, because I want everyone in the community to know each other. Like I'm already at 80 members, and I think I might just close it, because the chemistry has been so good that if I admit one more moron, it's in trouble, right? Like one person poisons the well. The structure is there's a private WhatsApp for that 80, which has been amazing. There's a more open circle community. All of my content is free. It's not a course. I promised myself I would never sell a course. So far, so good. Every 2 weeks for 4 months, I'm going to do a series. So the first one was on how do you accelerate expertise in business. Next week's is on attractors, the most exciting topic I've ever seen. Then it's going to be wisdom practices. How do you know which wisdom practice? How do you get an ecology and community? And so on and so forth. And it's going to end with my friend Mona Sobhani, who's done this extraordinary research into psychic phenomena and consciousness. I know you've had Bernardo Castro on your pod, but it says if her work is true, then so what? What does it mean for your practical life? So it's really exciting. It's the most interesting thing I've ever been involved in. If people are interested in that, they can read it for free. I don't believe in paywalling content, but if they want to see the footnotes and the book recommendations, that's going to be the content only subscription. That gives them access to the circle community, and it gives them access to like behind the fold, below the fold content. That's the structure I have for it. Maybe it'll change. And then there's a very high tier private coaching with just me for executives and C-suite guys, which is sort of not like a mainstream thing and is very capacity constrained because I'm busy enough as it is. But that's the model. And I think there's nothing special about that model at all. I think that what's special about it so far is that the community is unique. As I said, that basically it's like people with means and influence and the intention to do things with agency. And a lot of the other quote unquote spiritual communities I've been a part of don't have that combination. That either it's like a networking like YPO thing, or it's like some sort of meta-modern weirdo stuff. There's not much in the middle. So I guess I am doing the left-right hemisphere thing. I'm just trying to do it systemically.
Yeah. And has your community been predominantly males? How is that?
Yeah, it kind of sucks because like I wish it could be more balanced, but my audience is all of my coaching clients, like I don't advertise, but people contact me. For the last year, all of my coaching clients have been women, which is nuts because I've learned so much about like the almost radically different problem sets that women have. So clearly the universe being like, dude, diversify your cognition because otherwise you're going to end up being like the dude. But I would say, I'd say 80% male right now. But the women are probably more impressive than the men in terms of them being neuroscientists and professionals and founders. So at least I'm pleased about that. And I think the one thing I really want to address that I haven't so far is elders. That all of these communities do not have elders. Like I have a couple of people that I think are elders, but like I want people with lineage and like discernment, and I want them in the community that people can go to those guys and be like, have I lost my mind? And someone who's seen like 1,000 variants of this to speak about it. Elders are like a real blind spot for all of these communities right now. It can't be just hyper articulate 45-year-old dudes.
It's interesting because are you familiar with Emergent Commons?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
So they have a lot of people that are older there, and that the Emergent Commons was like kind of a community that bridged. It was before it was like Rebel Wisdom's community.
Yeah.
Like it was built off of Rebel Wisdom's thing. But it's interesting because there they actually have like a lot of the members that I see are older. They're actually elders. So that could be a good place to interact and see if anybody would want to hop along in with Leading Edge. The thing that I think that I totally agree with you on is the Dunbar number thing, the 150. And I've been thinking about this for a while too. So when I seen you doing that, I'm like, this is spot on. One of the problems I see is that a lot of communities grow too big, and then that kind of just dilutes it because you don't really know anybody. And it's like really difficult to interact. So that's definitely, I agree with that. And then there's some of the other problems I see with communities is you have communities that are free or very low cost, which really makes it hard for people to feel like they're invested. Like, you join a free community and then you just never show up again because every month you're not getting that bill and you're not, you don't think about it. So even if there's at least some kind of an investment, I find that there's more commitment.
Dude, I had this problem. Sorry, yeah, I think you cut you off. Like, this is the same money thing, right? Like, I was like, okay, I don't want this just to be people that can afford a lot of money.
Yeah,
right. I could have once I realized it. Within 2 weeks, I realized I could have priced it literally 10 times higher. So when I launched it, I priced it at $95 a month, which for me was like, that's for me personally, that would be enough of a hit that I would actually engage. Then after 3 weeks, I just doubled it because I was like, I don't care if no one else joins, but like I've clearly underpriced this. So now it's $200 a month, but like I could probably 10x that based on who's already in it. But then people that I would want to be in it wouldn't be in it. And so I do have a financial hardship option that anyone that applies to can apply. And if we like each other, I'll put them in the circle. And there are practitioners that I've grandfathered into the main community who are like, Mona Sobhani, who wrote that book. Like, it's so additive to have everyone else in the community that I want her in the community, and I don't expect her to pay because of the value she adds back to the community. But the money angle for these things, part of it, yeah, dude, I need to make a living. But part of it is a test case that I want people to pay for containers. I want people to pay for the feminine. I don't want them to pay for me. I don't want them to pay for a course. I want them to literally pay for the container. I want them to pay for a womb that's full of love. And that is anathema to the way that society is structured, that I want this to be a test case, that people can pay for membership to this thing, but it's actually paying for a container.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one other thing that I was thinking about is, are you charging monthly? Are you doing a monthly charge? Because that's another thing that I think about is that, and I've seen some communities switch that from going from monthly to doing like a quarterly or even a yearly commitment, because I feel like there's also this thing of like people coming and going.
It's a good idea. I might do that. Yeah, like just ensure commitment. Because like I think mentally, if people sign up for a year, it's very different from signing up for a month to month. Because again, they won't engage as much. Yeah, maybe I'll do that for the next people that apply.
Yeah, and the whole what's interesting when I see there's other people that are doing, obviously your community is unique in what you're doing, but when I see other people doing transformational communities, it's very inspiring for me. Because I don't see like, oh, there's one transformational community, there can't be more. Like, I really do see this network thing, and I really do see it like we're still tribal. So having this kind of 150 cap is beautiful. And then having actually communication between the communities and having like something I envision is having like this resource list and having this being able to connect people to teachers and facilitators and practitioners and communities that may help them with a specific issue that they're navigating. And like your community might have something that my community doesn't have or the other community doesn't have. And I can connect that person that's seeking that to connect with you and vice versa. So I think it's really cool to have this big network of different communities that all have their unique take. Like your community might be geared towards somebody who's more rationalist. Another community might be geared to somebody else that has a different kind of inclination or a different problem or something else they're trying to work on. So yeah, that's just kind of like a vision that I have. And I feel like also this online community space is so new. Like it really just started bubbling up like really after COVID.
It's going to happen. It's happening right now. It's going to happen. It's a question of how well we do it. We have a moral responsibility to do this right, where it's like, what resources are we sharing between each other? Like my community is mostly for people in transition. They're like, they've done it all and now they're looking around to see what's next. And it's got people looking for different things, but that's sort of the character around it. So like if anyone is attracted by my message and sort of my story, they'll come for that reason. But then if someone wants something totally different, I want to have a community I can like be like, dude, this isn't for you. Maybe you should go check out this one. Or we share resources or practitioners, and then the practitioners start to get really wealthy because they're providing value that's been proven across multiple different communities. This is going to happen. And what's weird actually is that I want this to be predominantly a digital community because everyone's like, oh, there's got to be lots of in real life stuff. I'm like, yeah, great. That's a solved problem. Anyone can go and have like a blow your doors off, circling, dialogue, psychedelic experience, some sort of peak experience for a weekend. It's the rest of the time that I'm interested in. How do you integrate that experience all the time? How do you get like grounded scientific resources that can actually give you confidence to make real lasting change, particularly in your direction in life? Like you can't come back from a weekend away and being like, darling, Mother Aya told me to quit my job. I'm leaving, right? That's not, I don't think that's how things work and probably isn't how they should work. So I'm like, I want people to be part of the community where they can play in a safe container for a long time.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, it would be really cool to collaborate more in the future and share kind of resources and just help interconnect. There's a lot of stuff that's on the liminal web that's bubbling up, and there's different practitioners and different communities that are there. So yeah, it's really cool to kind of be a part of that, and be in communication with different people that are doing this. I have a couple of more questions for you. Um, I'm curious, what makes you most angry about society today?
It's a good question, man. Wow, that's a good question. I try not to be angry about anything. Anger is lateralized in the left hemisphere, which shows something's triggered your ego. I get angry that I get frustrated that people shut down the idea that they can have faith in their own curiosity because they haven't been shown the resources that would let them have more faith in it. I'm not angry with people that don't know. I'm angry that people can know and don't. And part of the reason why I'm so evangelical about this thing is like, actually, like, dude, the science behind curiosity and the science behind following your bliss. And the reason why people get so angry about this topic is itself an indicator that it needs to be better explained.
Mm. When was the last time you cried tears of joy?
Not quite tears of joy, but this morning, someone messaged me in the community to say how much of an impact it had already had on them. And I went back with, I want this community to be full of love. And every time I say that, including now, it makes me like a little bit teary because it sounds like such an unbelievably cheesy thing to say. But it's like, if you can create a community that's full of love, it's going to work. And there aren't communities that are full of love for people, like love of ideas, love of practices, love of each other. And that's getting me at the moment.
Here's maybe this is the last one. What is something that you think is true that almost nobody agrees with you on?
Oh, the Peter Thiel question.
Yep.
Peter
Thiel question.
I'm not sure, but the question I'm having, and I think I'm finding out the answer, is that the universe loves us. I'd say most people don't believe that, but that if you find the right combination of where what only you can do meets what the world needs, the universe will respond with really mystical and unexpected abundance. And I would say that if you said that to 90% of people, they would give you a really funny look. But I'm like 70% there. I'm like 70% there. And maybe I'll never be beyond 70%, but based on recent evidence, me prodding the universe and being like, so do you love me? so far, indicators are good.
Yeah, I love that. I think most people probably think that the universe is indifferent, right? It's just like, it's, kind of a materialistic, nihilistic view. It's like the universe doesn't care. So that kind of really challenges that dominant view. Tom, really appreciate you coming on here and being able to kind of explore so much from your existential crisis and your work in finance and transitioning into being the curiosity Sherpa and pursuing wisdom and writing online and starting the Leading Edge community. Is there anything else, any kind of last words you want to share before we wrap up?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'd say that this network of networks thing is something we can work on for a long time, you and me and anyone else listening, which is like, it's not scalable, but everyone can start one of these things of our own, and we can bring the tribe back. I trace everything back to the violation of Dunbar's number and how lonely we're all getting and everything wrong. Like it's almost like a macro cause of everything. And we can start this all together by being really open to each other and not hoarding resources and making these little kind of loving communities that are also tied into agency. That I think that the time for like talking shops and intellectual discussions is kind of over, that these communities have to be oriented towards practicality and agency. But there's a lot to do there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks for having me, mate.